A couple of rules to go over before we start. Absolutely no eating or drinking. You do not want to get glaze in your mouth. Glaze is a special paint for clay that has powdered chemicals in it, so we don't want to leave it on our hands, and we don't want to accidentally get it in our mouth or eat it or drink it or any of that. It's just not safe to do. Some glazes are toxic. I try to work with non-toxic glazes, but it's a good practice and good habit to get into. This also includes no gum. So if you have gum, you want to spit it out before you start to glaze. If you've put lotion on your hands, you want to wash your hands with soap and water before you start to glaze. If you don't, what happens is sometimes you get areas where the glaze won't stick. Another rule, you do not want to put any glaze on the bottom of your project. If for some reason you do happen to get glaze on the bottom of your project, you're going to just take a sponge, a wet sponge, and wipe it off. And you'll notice the glaze comes right off the bottom of the project. If you do, what happens, it acts like a glue and it sticks to the kiln shelf, and the only way for me to get your project out is to actually break it with a hammer, and I don't want to do that. You want to use one color of glaze at a time. You'll notice I have them in these little containers. Sometimes the lids fit better than others depending on how I've ordered them, so when you carry them, please carry it like this. Glaze is a more expensive art supply that we work with, so we want to make sure that we're not wasting it and we're only going to add one color of glaze at a time, and you want 2 to 3 layers of each color of glaze. Don't apply glaze to an area that already has glaze unless it is a clear glaze, or if you do, be aware that it might not mix the way that you expect. So this project here shows a good example of that. Here they painted a pink glaze, and then the student went and put black dots over the top, and you can see it was fine. Here the student painted a black glaze and tried to do pink dots over it, and you can see some of them are really difficult to see. Same thing down here, you can see I used a teal glaze and then tried to put pink over it, and it didn't show up. Because glaze has a chemical reaction in the kiln, we can't always anticipate how the glazes are going to interact when we layer them. What I have found works fairly well is if you are going to layer them, do the lightest layer on the bottom and then do the darker layer on top, and then it's more likely to come out. Apply glaze like you would if you were painting. One thing I want you to consider, think about what size brush works best for the details that you're doing. So like here, I'm doing some of these smaller details, you would want to have a smaller brush, but when you have larger areas like here, you could work with a larger brush. Rinse off your paintbrush when you're done with a color, so that's why you have the water. You'll rinse it and then you can pick a different color. Try to limit your colors, try and repeat your colors to create unity throughout your project. Here they did a great job of repeating the red here and on the flower and on the top, but they only used the yellow once. So one way they could help create unity in their project was by painting this yellow, or putting yellow dots in the design, or making the inside of the project yellow, or the bottom of the lid yellow. So the more times that you can repeat a color, it can help it really have unity. At the end, you need to add 1 to 2 layers of clear glaze to your pottery to help make all your colors shiny and to seal any gaps. And don't forget, if you plan to eat or drink from your mug, you need to glaze the inside of your mug as well. And then make sure to wash your hands to remove any glaze after cleanup. Okay, so when you glaze, you're glazing a big area, you could use a bigger brush and you just apply it like you would paint. Don't glaze your entire project one color. What happens then is we lose all the details in your project. So like right here, if I just glazed it this way, you might lose the carved details that I have on the back of the owl here. And you'll notice one thing about this with the glaze, it's drying very quickly. So I almost have 1 layer in this area, and I would continue on around to the other side. Now I want you to think about what color this looks like. You might have said purple or pink. This color that's going on is actually this dark blue. So in the cups, a lot of times companies are now starting to tint them to make them look similar to the color, but it's not going to be exact. In fact, we have a chart up against the wall that you can look at that will show you the different glaze colors, what they turn out to be. So let's go take a look at that. See over here by the sinks, we have a glaze chart. So the blue that I was talking about This is what it'll look like once it's fired. So I've added one layer here. You'll remember, if you think back to our glazing handout, it said that we need 2 to 3 of each color. So I would take my brush and I would start a second coat of glaze. So that's what I mean by 2 to 3 layers of a color. You go back over that same area 2 or 3 times. That's what helps your color turn out most true. Sometimes if you only do one layer, it's too thin and it'll end up light or spotty, so it helps to have multiple layers. Now, one thing I want to point out, when you're glazing something that's 3-dimensional, you have to be careful. So if I didn't want the wings here to be blue, all of a sudden now they are going to be blue because I got blue along there. So one of the techniques that you might think about when you're glazing is that you might take a small brush and go around the edges of the area that you're glazing with a color. So that way, when you glaze close to it, you won't get that color on there, because now that that blue is there, it's gonna remain there. Even if I took like a clean brush or a sponge and I went over it, I could make it lighter, but there's still going to be kind of a hint of a color unless I went over it with a much darker color. So that's something to be careful of. Really try and have a controlled technique. I want to make sure I don't have a lot of water in my brush when I'm glazing, so after I rinse it, I dry it off on a paper towel. So I could take an outline here, and then the same thing right along this edge. If I didn't want it to have the color in this section, I could take my small brush, outline around there, and then I could come back in with like a medium-sized brush and fill in the other areas a lot more quickly without having to worry about getting that into those areas. Now, if you're wanting to do something with some small details, you want to make sure you don't have too much glaze on your brush. You want to make sure you have a small brush. So like here, if I wanted these details to stand out, I would just work really slowly and carefully with the small brush to go over those. You want to be careful when you are glazing that you help those details stand out. So like these character details from this student's project wouldn't have stood out as much. Here she carved in her name, and when we're up close we can see it, but if I was holding this in the back of the classroom, you would have a much harder time noticing this detail. So make sure, like here, the student did a great job of going over their design with glaze to help it stand out.